So I did want to play a little bit more Renaissance music for you guys in this Patreon post. So I'm going to talk a little bit more about a couple pieces. That was Robinson's May by the composer Thomas Robinson. He kind of flourished around 1589 to 1609, so right kind of in the center of the Renaissance. And there's a lot of things, kind of going on in that piece. But one that I would like to point out is you heard me talk about that word polyphony. And how in the Renaissance we really get kind of the apex of polyphony in music. It was this new technique the composers have been using. And you heard it in that last line that kind of gets repeated a few times. So what's going on is in the medieval period, they would have just played kind of like one of those by themselves. So something like... maybe they vary it up. And you would have had just one singer sing that. And you could have had a whole choir, 10, 20 people, but they'd all be singing that melody, just by itself, and that would be called monophony, mono being one. But by the time we get to the Renaissance period, they start turning it into polyphony, where you get two melodies going on at the same time. So we have that lower one that I just played for you. But over top of that, kind of in conversation with it, kind of going back and forth, you hear this other melody. Which is, really, really kind of lovely. And the way they kind of sparse the rhythm, I don't know if you'll be able to see the score too well, but you can see that they kind of go back and forth. Boom, 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 boom. Don't pay attention to my singing. But the notes kind of go back and forth with each other. So you've got kind of this higher melody up above. It plays a note, and then the lower melody plays a note, and then the higher melody against it, and then below it. And then they both kind of collide together, but when they collide, they actually, you find out that they're working together. So it's really cool sounding. So. I'll play it one more time. So playing against each other. And then here they come to collide. And what's really cool is, as these melodies are kind of, they're in a sense, they're actually kind of copying each other. I'll talk a little bit more about, there's another piece I'm going to play for you in a few minutes, where they really, really copy each other. But during the Renaissance, they really kind of considered this concept of unity to be essential to the music they're writing, to kind of represent the unity and the order that they saw in the world and in God's creation, that sort of thing. So when you hear these two melodies kind of at first sort of seem at odds with each other, but they're kind of working, and then for them to come together and resolve on... that was really important at this time. You hear that little note right there. That is what we call a leading tone. And you hear how that really, really, really wants to resolve here to A. So we call that note a leading tone because it's leading you back to the center note of this piece, when it turns out to be an A natural. And that too is something that in the medieval period, right before the Renaissance, they wouldn't have been using that note as much. They were actually using this note. So in the medieval period, if they'd written this melody, it'd probably sound more like this. Sorry, let me play it right. Which sounds great. But by the time we get to the Renaissance period, they start borrowing that extra note, that and that little note, as inconsequential as it may seem, that little note, that technique of a leading tone, is actually what the whole foundation of the rest of classical music is going to be built on up until the late 1800s. And I'll talk more about that in further videos, but it turns into this concept of the tonic. And the tonic is the chord that everything wants to start at and everything wants to return to. And composers needed a good way to signal that return, and so they used the leading tone. And so now to our ears, today in the 21st century, we're very used to hearing this. We're very used to, oh, okay, yeah, of course, that's got to resolve like that. But during the medieval period, right before the Renaissance, during the medieval period, that note was actually kind of considered out of bounds, or not. You weren't really allowed to use that note because you had to borrow it from a different mode and a few other technical things. I'll probably do a video on modes later. But before the Renaissance period, that note was a little bit against the rules. Obviously, there's always exceptions, and people did use it. But it's really once we hit the Renaissance period and this music that I'm playing for you now that that leading tone starts to show up all over the place. You might start to hear some of it in this next little piece. I did tell you that I wanted to talk a little bit more about the copying that's going on. This next piece I'm going to play for you guys is just called it's just a duo. At least in that time they called it a duo. Nowadays we would call it a canon. And I could describe what that means here in a second, but it's by a fellow named Miguel de Fuenllana. And he kind of had an interesting story in that he was born blind, and he played a lot of organ music, and he wrote a lot of music, not just for the organ, but also for what was called the vihuela, which kind of looked like a guitar during the Renaissance period. Maybe I can find a picture and splash it up here. Kind of looked like a guitar, but it's much smaller. Didn't, kind of have the same string settings, that sort of thing. But again, it did kind of sound bright. Pause right there and I'll play the rest of it for you in a second, but I want to go over a few things so that we know what to listen to when we listen to this little duo. Going back to, remember we have that phrase polyphony, right? So polyphony is when we have two or more melodies happening simultaneously, and that's what we get in this piece, but it's almost very mathematical is not the right term. I don't know that I like the term mathematical. But it's very calculated in a sense. It doesn't mean that it's unemotional or anything. I think this piece has got a very lovely, distinct flavor, especially right here. I mean, that just always makes me think of castles. That sound world. It's just the kind of idiosyncrasies that composers had at this time. That sound that really just sounds Renaissance. I love it. But what's going on in this piece? The reason I'm calling Miguel decided to call it a duo is because it's like you've got two instruments playing. And I'm sure you might have heard that. At the very, very beginning, what's going to happen is there's a little melody, just a little chunk, just a few notes, technically called a motif, but it's just a little chunk of notes. And you hear this. That's really all Miguel needed to start this piece. It's technically only two notes, but it's, B, C, B. And as soon as he arrives at the end of that, he copies that shape. So it starts on B, goes up to C, goes back down to B. Okay? So that little shape, he takes that little shape and he copies it, but he puts it up in the higher part of the vihuela. B, C, B. Okay, what's cool about that is we have order, right? We're taking something, there's unity. We're just taking the exact same shape, but there's also a little bit of novelty. There's a little one tiny little change, and all he's doing is he's taking it from the lowest part of the instrument and just putting it up one register higher. Okay? And that little change is enough to make the music interesting to where it's not boring, right? But what's also happening at the same time, okay, so we've got the first shape on the lower part of the guitar. As soon as it finishes, we get the higher shape. But while we're getting the higher shape right there, we're getting a new shape in the lower part of the guitar. Okay, so we're getting like shape 2 right here. It says E, D, B, C. So let's see if we can hear that. Okay, so you're going to hear the first shape in the lower part of the guitar. You're going to hear that shape copied up above. But while it's getting copied up above, we're actually getting a new shape underneath. Hopefully you heard that. I'll play it one more time. First shape, second shape with the new one. It's really, really, really lovely. Well, guess what happens when you get the copied shape underneath? Or, I'm sorry, the new shape underneath. As soon as that new shape finishes, we're going to get that shape copied up in the high register. E, D, B, C. And this is just going to happen all the way throughout the piece. That's why I say we would usually call it a canon, because it's kind of like we get the first melody by itself down here, but then it's canonized or copied again in another spot up above. And so it's just kind of like these two melodies are kind of chasing each other all the way through. In the lower register, we're almost always hearing the new shapes or the new ideas. And above that, you're going to hear all of these copies. I'm just going to play it actually for a few more bars. So I'm going to play a good third of it. Because what I want you to hear is, as these two melodies are chasing each other, it's just going to keep building and building and building and building and kind of getting more and more dramatic until we kind of we reach this point where everything's going to break apart. And up to this point, the rhythm has been relatively slow. It's just like one, it starts with half notes. 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. But then it's going to kind of cut in half, and so then you're going to start hearing these 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. And then eventually, when all of this drama is just adding up and these melodies are chasing each other, you're going to hit this point where the melody or the rhythm just breaks apart and it just starts going to 1 and 2, 3, 1 and 2 and 3 and 4, and it's a really cool effect. So I'll point it out when we get there. Get some dissonant notes. More dissonant notes. Here it goes. And then from there we actually run off. When I play the whole piece for you in a second, there is going to be this page turn I got to make. So sorry to break the flow there. But again... This is one of my favorite parts right here. Both of these melodies, they actually both just like clamp together like this. And then we get this really cool run where the bass line is just going to start you're going to hear it. And as soon as you hear that, you're going to hear the higher melody copy that shape again. And so this is really like kind of the final climax of this little this small little duo here. But notice with such skill, this composer is kind of laying out something that starts small, starts seemingly innocent, and it just keeps building and building and building and building. And it just gets faster. It starts using more and more of these dissonant notes that don't necessarily belong in the key, and it's always using the same principle, though. That principle is all the way through there. That principle of here's a basic shape, copy the basic shape with one little change, and introduce a new shape, copy that shape again with a little change. But while it's systematic and while it seems very calculated, at the same time, to the mind's ear, or to the ear in general, there's so much new information happening that it really is. It's just fun to listen to. It's just kind of like light bulbs going off in your brain the whole time. So I'm going to try playing this. I'll play that one little phrase so you hear that. And now I'm actually going to play the whole duo all the way through itself. So do forgive me for the page turn, but you know, it's what we got. What I got to do right now.